Good morning, Mr. Turner.
Good morning, my Lord. This morning, my Lord, we have a panel of witnesses speaking about young people. We have Mr. Tim Frew from YouthLink Scotland, Dr. Mary Crawford from LGBT Youth Scotland, and Mr. Jamie Dunlop from the Scottish Youth Parliament.
Good morning to you all.
Good morning.
Morning.
Right, very good. When you're ready, Mr. Turner.
Thank you, my Lord. Good morning.
Morning.
Just a brief reminder before we start, this morning's hearing will be transcribed. If we could try and speak as slowly and clearly as possible, that will help the stenographers greatly, and if we can try to avoid speaking over each other, no matter how enthusiastic we get this morning, that would be great. I'm going to ask you each in turn, first of all, if you could just state your full name, confirm your current position, and if different, any position that you had during the pandemic. And if I could start with you, Mr. Frew.
Good morning, my name is Tim Frew, Chief Executive of YouthLink Scotland.
Thank you. And Dr. Crawford.
Hello, my name is Vary Crawford, Chief Executive of LGBT Youth Scotland.
Thank you. And Mr. Dunlop.
Hi, my name's Jamie Dunlop. I'm Chief Executive of the Scottish Youth Parliament. However, during COVID, I was Deputy Chief Executive.
Thank you. Each of you has given a statement to the inquiry. And in fact, Mr. Frew, you have given two statements at this point to the inquiry. Your current statement for these purposes is SCI WT 0267 number 2, and your previous statement was number 1. And you also gave evidence on the 20th of November 2024 in the education hearings, is that correct?
Correct.
Thank you. And Dr. Crawford, your statement is reference SCI WT 07491, and Mr. Dunlop, yours is SCI WT 0304 number 1. Everything in those statements will be taken into account by His Lordship in due course. We're going to discuss this morning some of the matters that arise in those. We may not get to all of it this morning, but of course everything will be taken into account regardless. Could I start, please, by asking each of you a little about your organisations? Perhaps we could start with three basic things. First of all, the core aims. Secondly, the members who it represents. And thirdly, the type of work that the organisation undertakes, just generally in terms of before the pandemic. So that's aims, members and work, if we could. And Mr. Dunlop, perhaps we could start with you first of all.
No problem. The Scottish Youth Parliament is the democratically elected voice of Scotland's young people. We work with young people aged 14 to 25 to have their rights heard by decision makers and their voices heard by decision makers. We aim to make Scotland the best place to grow up, along with a number of other charities. And we regularly meet with decision makers to ensure that young people are heard at the highest level of government. We meet with the Scottish Government's executive team and cabinet once a year in a joint cabinet meeting where young people chair that. We work in all 32 Scottish local authorities and 11 national voluntary organisations. We're a youth work organisation. We exist to platform UNCRC, United Nations Convention of the Right of the Child, across Scotland, and along with others were instrumental in getting that passed into Scots law recently.
Thank you. Dr. Crawford.
So LGBT Youth Scotland is a national charity for LGBTQ plus young people aged 13 to 25. Our aim is that any LGBTQ plus young person in Scotland can flourish and thrive, whatever that actually means to them. As a charity, we support young people across Scotland, again across all 32 local authorities. We do that through a youth work provision, so we're supporting young people directly. But we also then work with those young people to amplify their voices and use that to engage with and influence politicians, decision makers at a local and a national level. We work very strongly to make sure that it is the young people's voice which is heard, and often actually the young people will present and actually enable themselves to do that as well. So I suppose it's a bit of a journey for them from actually receiving direct support from us to then them developing and influencing policy and practice themselves.
Thank you. And Mr. Frew.
Yeah, so YouthLink Scotland is the national agency for youth work. We are supporting organisations all across Scotland doing youth work. We're an independent company and charity, but we work very much as the intermediary for the youth work sector, working with government, public health and a range of different partners. There are over 100 organisations that are part of the membership of YouthLink Scotland, including the two agencies to my left, and all 32 local authorities are also members of YouthLink. And our key aim is to support high-quality youth work across Scotland, and we do a range of different things in terms of communications, policy, supporting cross-party groups at Parliament, research, innovation, and just general support to the sector to deliver for young people.
Thank you. The inquiry has heard a variety of evidence into the pandemic at this stage. As you perhaps know, today is our last day of hearing in respect of the impacts. A lot of the evidence has turned around changes that were required to be made due to, in particular, lockdown. And I'd like to talk to you about that, in particular how it affected your organisation and the individuals that you supported. Dr. Crawford, if I could come to you first, perhaps you could tell us about the impacts. What were the main things that you noted when we went into lockdown?
In terms of impact on young people, there was a lot of anxiety. Immediately, young people are just very worried about keeping themselves safe. But on top of that, for quite a number of our young people, it was twofold. For some, it was actually a very positive experience. It gave them the space maybe to reflect on their own orientation or identity and actually work through that in an environment where it could be more supportive, or just give them the space that they would need to actually reflect on that and then think about their own journey. However, for some other LGBTQ+ young people, they were put into a less safe environment, and that might be one that was not as supportive or not as welcoming, which meant they were unable to be, I suppose, who they truly were, and actually having to adapt their behaviours, adapt their looks to maintain safety in that living environment. That had quite a significant detrimental impact on some of their mental health. So that was, I suppose, that's one significant challenge that we found. Those young people would quite often find it also very difficult to get support for that because of a lack of privacy, because of a lack of access to digital or online support, which was available. But for some of them it would be down to digital poverty. Some of them it would be down to a lack of a safe environment to progress with that, because screens or screen time and others were being monitoring. Positively, there was a lot of funding and access to be able to address some of that digital poverty. However, that wasn't universal, and we weren't able to access, I suppose, every young person that may have needed that.
Thank you. Mr. Dunlop, there are obviously a great number of different impacts that have affected young people. Did the Scottish Youth Parliament, either by themselves or in conjunction with others, undertake any work to find out what those impacts were?
Yeah, so during the first lockdown, Scottish Youth Parliament, Young Scot and YouthLink developed a project proposal called Lockdown Lowdown, which looked to seek the views of young people around how they had experienced or what they were experiencing during the lockdown. That was then replicated during the second lockdown, Lockdown Lowdown Phase 2, which the first lockdown lowdown looked at a kind of broad range, a national consultation, and we spoke to members of the Scottish Youth Parliament about their experiences. And the second phase looked at seldom heard groups, young carers, young people with disabilities, young LGBT people, young people with experience of criminal justice. So it kind of did a bit more of a deep dive into what those specific groups were experiencing.
Thank you. And sorry, you said that was repeated during the pandemic. Did you find that there were changes noted within over the course of the pandemic?
I think as things developed with the pandemic, so I kind of see it in two linear things. So the first lockdown, the people hadn't experienced anything like that in their life before, whereas the second lockdown, there was young people expected or knew what to expect, but there was slightly different rules. I think the key experiences were around education, young people's right to an education, and how the education system differed between the first lockdown and the second, especially around how assessments and exams were carried out. And that had changed significantly based on the learning from the first lockdown. So yeah, I think there were differences between the two.
Mr. Frew, YouthLink Scotland was obviously involved with that as well. Did YouthLink note any particular matters?
Yes, referring to the lockdown lowdown survey, I think there was clear concerns for young people's mental health and well-being, especially with the first survey. 77% of young people worried about their mental health. In April, we did see some change as young people started to return to education in November. There was 40% of young people were worried about their mental health, so you could see that sort of development and the track of change with return to education. One of the challenges, though, was that for some young people, they didn't return to education as quickly, and there was also a lack of access to youth work services and youth work facilities. So if we think about youth education in its broadest sense, a broad general education, those opportunities to have youth work interventions in the evenings and weekends, and also for some young people that weren't attending school for whatever reason, the opportunity for them was not as, they could feel more isolated from that. So yes, we saw changes during those lockdown lowdown surveys. It was all really helpful and useful information for public health and others, because we were engaging when other services through formal schooling and didn't have the same kind of standardised surveys that had been being used. So it was really helpful, useful information. On top of that, we had a COVID recovery group within the youth work sector, so we were able to feed information from grassroots communities in all parts of Scotland, whether in rural areas and urban, and see the differences that were maybe emerging in different places, and report that back to government.
You mentioned there that there were difficulties accessing youth work services. Was there any particular reason for that?
So maybe just to say a wee bit more about that, there was a great pivot in terms of youth work services, so towards online opportunities for children and young people, some fantastic digital provision, as well as detached youth work as well, going out to something that we used to be much more invested in the past, but youth workers going out on bikes to see young people in different areas and communities, and also outdoor centres. So there was a lot of that going, but in terms of, sorry, what was the question again?
I was asking you about, in fact, I'm going to ask you a different question first. I'll come back to the question I asked in a moment, but could you just tell us, you used a phrase there, detached youth work. Could you just explain briefly what that is, and then I'll ask my question again? Yeah,
sorry. So detached youth work is about youth workers going out to meet young people in the community where they are, whether they're gathered, whether they are assembled, and it's very much working on outcomes with the children and young people on their terms. So meeting young people in their communities, and providing activities for them and co-creating sort of educational learning and fun opportunities with them where they are at.
Thank you. And my question previously was, were there any particular reasons why access to youth work was being impacted?
Yeah, so one of the things was that youth workers, especially in local authorities, so it's great to do this pivot towards different offers, but some of them were also helping with community hubs. Some were helping with social work and residential care homes. So in terms of the flexibility in and around youth work, which is often very good. In the case of COVID, it meant that people were stepping in to do other things, food provision as well. So their core youth work delivery was affected by that. But the other aspect of those services being affected was when there was a return to youth work services, and I don't know if we'll go into this in more detail, their youth work was seen as very much an educational offer, but it wasn't given the same sort of key worker or essential worker status. And so that did mean that we had to sort of work with government to sort of really reinforce the importance of this provision for young people. So there was a joint statement from COSLA and the Scottish Government at one point, just getting across to local authorities and others the importance of maintaining youth work provision, because it wasn't always available for young people for a number of different reasons, and sometimes that was also about facilities, and I can say much more about that as well.
Well, why don't we just talk about facilities now, if I may. Dr. Crawford, you've mentioned before about changes of access of spaces. Could you tell us anything about how you found the availability of space for young people during the pandemic?
Absolutely. May I just elaborate on one point Tim just made as well? There was a lack of parity between local authority and voluntary organisations in terms of youth work. So when, for example, local authorities were given key worker status in terms of youth work to be able to go and do detached youth work, that was not an option for the voluntary organisations, which impacted how we could deliver. Now, we are very fortunate as one of the organisations, we were able to switch very quickly to digital delivery and ensure that young people were supported, but we weren't able to engage with them face to face. In terms of our spaces, overnight we delivered across 11 local authorities, 23 groups a week, and everything had to move online. Across all the partner spaces, so across that we had three venues which were our own, but the remaining venues that we worked across were all through partners with different local authorities. Some were with the local authorities, some were with local other charities. And because of the guidance and the rulings around access to these spaces, it took a very long time for us to be able to re-engage, much, much longer than, for example, with local authority work setting up. In terms of a practical impact for us as a charity, we had to negotiate new contracts, new access arrangements, work with every single venue separately to look at risk assessments, look at their approach to safety, PPE, for example. We had to make sure, and that, I suppose, for a small team, that was a significant amount of work. That further delayed engaging with young people on a face-to-face basis, and that then meant that they were, I suppose, not able to access that youth work in terms of education, in terms of that safe space, that ability for them to be their true selves. Just have that voice. I'm just thinking of sort of UNC articles 12, 16, and I've forgotten the education one.
28 and 29.
Thank you, Jamie, 28 and 29. But it was much longer for those young people to access, and there also wasn't parity across the local authorities because it took a long time to implement, and some local authorities were much faster than others. I hope that answers where you were going.
It does. If I could ask you a follow-up question, though, you mentioned their speed, and in terms of some local authorities moving faster than others, was that position resolved over the pandemic, or are there any continuing issues?
We now have all our services up and running, so yes, it has been resolved. Was it timely? No. Some local authorities were much more responsive than others. And that is not necessarily a detriment to them. Every local authority responded to the guidance in different ways. But it meant that, for example, some local authorities opened up for their own services, but they didn't open up for partner work. and that was much sort of further delayed. And you will see that right across the youth work sector. So while I'm experiencing it from sort of an LGBTQ plus young person's perspective, you would have, if you'd engage with sort of the uniformed organisations like Scouts or Guides who maybe use church halls or other local authority buildings, they would have had a similar experience as well. And there was just disparity right across Scotland.
Thank you. Mr Dunlop, did the Scottish Youth Parliament have any experience of that kind of difficulty?
Before I answer that question, your previous question you asked me around the differences between the two, I have a quote from a young carer who took part in the lockdown response that said that my young carer service was really active at the start of lockdown, but then it hit a certain point and it stopped, and when it stopped we needed them the most. It's been 4 months since I've heard from anyone at my carer centre. They just dropped out. As a young carer, you don't really want to discuss some things, so I think when we had that support or those group calls, it was really useful. And I think that was the transition between the two. I think similar to what Vary said, the first lockdown, everybody was very quick to change and move online and adapt their services. But then when the second lockdown hit, other staff were redeployed to other places, so the services were slightly eroded. And could you ask me the second question again?
In terms of the Scottish Youth Parliament,
Yeah.
how did it find in terms of access to spaces and the like?
So the Youth Parliament meets as a whole twice a year. And that brings all the young people together to debate, to discuss policy, to train, and to kind of be a collective. We don't have a physical building as such. All of our services went online, all of our work went online. We had to think, as everybody else did, of ways to capture young people who had spent 7 hours online at school, who then wanted to do something that wasn't school in the evening, and we had to think of ways to engage them in a meaningful way. We had to move all of our sittings, all of those collective events online. We were due to be in the Scottish Parliament, and we were due to do a sitting on Orkney, which were all postponed. Whilst we don't run any direct services, similar to my two colleagues, or have experience of that, young people are supported on the ground by local authority youth workers, and they were often redeployed into other areas to support the COVID response. So SYP took on much more of a role to support the day-to-day of MSYPs. I think we were quite late in opening back up to face-to-face activity because of our bringing young people from across Scotland to one place. We wanted to see how others were doing it, and there wasn't necessarily guidance at that point about how to reopen. So we didn't. We took the decision not to be one of the first organisations to hold a national event bringing people from all stretches of the country together. But we were able to pick back up quite quickly after the lockdown ended.
Thank you. Mr. Frew, just sticking with this topic for a moment in terms of access to facilities, did YouthLink Scotland note any particular differences or any particular issues depending on the type of facilities that were being accessed? Yes,
absolutely. We did 3 or 4 surveys about this issue because we saw a running issue in terms of getting access to facilities, whether it be, leisure centres, whether it be community halls, faith-owned buildings, or public sector buildings, schools. So the variability of that was noted, and at one point we, with the sector, we had 70% of the third sector had opened their buildings fully, but only 40% of the public sector were opened fully to youth work. We actually ran a campaign in around this to raise the profile and awareness. It was called the Youth Work Needs a Home campaign. And what we were noting was that Scotland had moved towards more and more shared facilities, making most use of community schools and community halls. But because of the different age, dimensions of the COVID strategy, some community buildings were just closed completely, even though they could have been open for youth work activity and for youth work offers. That also included sometimes community buildings having equipment that could be used for youth work that youth workers couldn't actually access. I remember in one case in the Borders where they were trying to get access to the actual equipment to work with young people. It was permitted to work with young people, but they couldn't get access to the equipment because there was a blanket closing down. Now, we understand the reasons behind that. There was extra cleaning costs, there was staffing costs to do cleaning in schools, ventilation. There was lots of investment in these things, but I do think that the third sector voluntary community-run buildings were opened quickly, or more quickly than public buildings for youth work. And I think that, given the amount of investment in some of those buildings and cleaning costs, which wasn't available to the voluntary sector, I think that's something for us to reflect on.
You've mentioned perhaps some of the reasons why those buildings weren't open. Do you know of or do you understand any particular reason why there was such a disparity between the third sector buildings and the local authority owned buildings or the publicly owned buildings?
So it's difficult to put that into, because there's a number of variabilities. Some may have been that there's too many key holders. So if you look at schools and school buildings, it was very much left to school head teachers maybe to talk about that, and they were focused very much on the provision during the school day, which is understandable. But if Edinburgh University did some research on this and talked about a lack of parity of esteem between the education formal sector and the youth work sector, and that was part of their report, that sometimes people were making decisions even though the guidance was saying this should happen and it should be permitted to happen in a community hall. Some people's perceptions of what was going on meant they said, well, this just looks like fun leisure activity, where it wasn't. It was key educational activity that was happening in the evening, and for some young people they would attend that and not attend school. So some of it could have been about perceptions of what was safe and not safe to do. I do wonder if there was more hoops to jump through, even though there was the same guidance for some of the public buildings in terms of the number of assessments that needed to happen to sort of open that facility. Maybe felt like too much to do to get it open for, say, a Tuesday night and a Thursday evening drop-in. Well, why would we open the building for that in terms of the costs and where our priorities are? But there's a disparity there in terms of community buildings and community halls that were being opened more quickly to youth work activity. And it did raise a question, I think, for us about dedicated youth spaces. So in other countries, in Germany and some other countries that we visited in Europe, they have dedicated youth facilities. And youth work didn't really have dedicated youth facilities. It was relying on leisure centres, community schools, community halls and buildings. Lots of reasons around this, understandable in terms of especially those representing old people groups not wanting to open the facility. But given that youth work was to be open at the same time along with schools, then some young people were missing out on critical activity. We had some brilliant pivoting, again, of the sector. I remember visiting a project up in Elgin where they had managed to, with Scouts and other organisations, set up a marquee so that young people who were doing employability-related skills were able to do outdoor cooking and different things as part of that. However, at that point, it was an educational youth work activity, and it could have happened in one of the buildings. So there is that thing about different people's interpretation of guidance.
Do you feel there was any, I was going to use the word disparity, but that probably implies something, any difference between the way that youth work was given access in comparison to perhaps other organisations or services or groups?
Yes, I mean, I think we made a strong case, as was across the UK and other places, about youth work being a key, vital educational offer. And I do understand that that some people could understand that from their experience and some of the youth work in schools activity and some of the work around closing the poverty-related attainment gap. So that was there. I can understand that for others, when it seemed to be more generic play activity, if you like, which is equally valid, but there may have been a perception that was more difficult to manage in terms of COVID and COVID restrictions and keeping safe distancing and so on. So yes, I can understand that different people would have different perspectives on that, but the message, as I say, from the research was that in some cases the guidance was there. We also did a lot of sort of social media activity with around the joint statement from COSLA and the Scottish Government and the Minister to say there is this activity is educational and it should be sort of made available and accessible to children and young people. But some people still, for lots of reasons to do with cost and cleaning costs and all the rest of it, didn't actually get the sort of services open as quickly as I think they could have.
Thank you. Dr. Crawford, you've mentioned already one of the ways that not having access to facilities is addressed is in terms of the digital world. In terms of your organisation, was there anything in particular that was put in place to facilitate that?
Yes, LGBT Youth Scotland had, I suppose, been fortunate in that we were already developing a digital platform to support young people who could not access our physical services. It's on, young people had told us that they are often on a platform called Discord, which is a gaming chat engagement platform. You can do video chat, text chat, and it's also very nice from a youth work perspective because you can put in a lot of controls and safeguards. We had been very fortunate to be developing that platform already for rural environments or for environments where young people may not feel safe to access face-to-face services, be that for faith-based, refugee, or also for some, for whatever reason they were not able to access face-to-face. We were able to pivot that very quickly to then offer that, or to launch that service and to be able to offer it to young people across Scotland. So any LGBTQ plus young person who wanted to engage with us was then able to engage and access on that platform. It meant that we were able to take what had been physically face-to-face services to then be, I suppose, online services. So we were able to deliver our 23 groups weekly there, plus additional digital-only groups for young people who hadn't engaged before. They could chat, they could engage. It gave them the sense of community, but it also gave them the access to that informal education, the access to a space where their voices are listened to and their rights were respected. It's still in use now, and actually throughout COVID we had a role in terms of educating others of this being a platform. The model was taken by quite a number of other organisations, and we were able to sort of provide support and training so that they could adapt in a similar way as well.
I think you did mention it in passing when you spoke earlier on, but were there any particular benefits or detriments to any of the people that you were supporting by moving to a digital platform?
Both, I think is the answer. So for some young people, being able to be online, being able to be there without a camera on, meant that they were able to engage in a way that they couldn't before. So if you had a young person who struggled to see themselves on camera due to dysmorphia, being able to be on screen and engage in a group without a camera on was really powerful because they could just be there and engage in a way that suited them. We also had young people who, for example, were unable to engage. And there's one particular young person I remember from Falkirk who over the course of 2 or 3 months went from being able to just sitting there and listening to being able to type and to engage. And then actually over that period, eventually they were able to come on the voice chat. And that's just a fantastic progression of them gaining confidence, developing new skills and finding that way to get that support and engagement in the youth groups and the offering. The flip side of that is that for some of our young people, it wasn't safe. They weren't able to access our services due to the environment that they were living in. Now, that might mean that they weren't able to come in and chat. They didn't have any access to one-to-one support. They had no peer network. It was very isolating. For some people, it was down to the environment. Other people, it was also down to digital poverty. And while we were able to provide as many devices as possible, there were always going to be young people across Scotland we couldn't reach. So I think there was definitely some positives, but there was also some real challenges. And the final bit on that, as Jamie touched on, after for example, if it was a school student, if they'd been online and for 7 hours during the day, or they've been attending online lectures or something like that, then asking them to come on and engage in an online group is very challenging because I'm sure you've heard a lot about digital fatigue. So it's finding ways that we could engage them and have them thinking and working with us in a way that doesn't feel like work, but also gave them the educational elements that they were maybe looking for.
Thank you. Mr Dunlop, Dr Crawford's just mentioned there the issue of digital poverty. Was that a matter that the Scottish Youth Parliament came across?
Yeah, we found it through our lockdown, lowdown research. Kind of two key points that I'd like to make. One, families, we were told, especially on a few occasions, a family of 4 were sharing one digital device. They were sharing one laptop or one iPad, and that had to be what parents were using to work and what children and young people were using to study or learn on. So kind of that digital poverty, but also digital exclusion and general exclusion during the pandemic was fed back to us by young people on a number of different occasions. And I think during the pandemic, I wouldn't just call it digital exclusion, I would call it exclusion from learning or exclusion from socialising as well, which impacted children's rights. And another kind of quote from our lockdown, lowdown research was that most participants agreed that it was needed, that they were provided with a device and data to be able to access their education. Some local authorities rolled out schemes where every pupil got a laptop or an iPad to learn. But there were some, that wasn't the same case across Scotland. Some local authorities did not offer that, or some schools did not offer that. And some families had to go into debt to buy laptops or to buy digital equipment so that their child or young person's educational experience wasn't detrimented for that. But also some young people, both MSYPs, but also young people that we engaged with through this consultation, didn't have enough data, so there was a kind of data poverty as well, and internet poverty to be able to access the online world, whether that be learning, whether that be social space, whether that be some of the learning through youth work and the other provisions that have been talked about, and that young people were desperate to go back to some kind of face-to-face to have that human connection, but also have that ability to learn in a kind of traditional environment.
You mentioned there the ability to have face-to-face. I mean, do you have any understanding of what effect that's had on the generation that's coming through at the moment?
Not first-hand, but I think you can post-COVID, post-lockdown, there have been a number of challenges in terms of the current financial climate that we are seeing, disinvestment in youth work, and maybe Tim can talk more about that, but disinvestment in youth work, disinvestment in services. So over the past 5 years since COVID, but also prior to that, there has been an erosion of youth work services across Scotland in terms of that investment from government and local authorities. I think you're starting to see the impacts of that disinvestment in youth work in some of the societal issues that are appearing. So, yeah, I'm not sure, Tim, if you've got anything you want to say on that.
Yes, I could speak to that. I think one of the interesting things was when we were surveying the sector during the pandemic, 70% believed that cuts to youth work budgets would happen post-COVID. So sadly, that prediction has come true in terms of the squeeze on public finances. So once we look at COVID, then we look at the effects of even things like Brexit. There's a number of funding sources that have kind of dried up, and also the extra increase in terms of some public sector pay deals have actually, for teachers and so on, which while they are welcome, have squeezed especially local authorities. So we've seen a 50% reduction in local authority youth workers over the last 8 years. There was concerns pre-pandemic about the overall youth work sector, and in terms of the impact on young people during the pandemic, there's so many really. A number of youth workers reported the the key transition points that youth work's involved in terms of P7 to S1 transition. It's quite often youth workers take a lot of a key role in that. Then they also the transition 15 to 16-year-olds into employability and skills and colleges or other programmes, those that are not going for a traditional route, and the real importance of being supported at that point. And there's been a recent kind of summit in and around antisocial behaviour as well. And I think in terms of, while I wouldn't, that wouldn't be just tracked to sort of youth work services, there's a range of different factors in terms of, social media and so on. I do think there is some correlation between, the lack of youth work spaces and activities for children and young people. So, yeah, I believe there are legacy issues coming out of the pandemic. Also, if we look before the period of the pandemic, mental health and well-being in Scotland was already, doing poorly in terms of the health behaviour in school study compared to other European countries. So we already had kind of an issue in and around this. So things like youth work, things like outdoor education as well and outdoor spaces, I think there's an increasing awareness that some of the offer for children and young people beyond the sort of confines of the school offer have been diminished. One other thing to add to that, just to add as well around volunteers and volunteer numbers. So we've seen a decline in volunteer numbers for some of the youth organisations. Some of that might have been naturally older people stepping away, maybe long-term volunteers who, after the COVID period, took that opportunity to step away. But also if you combine that as well with, I think across the UK, government funding to the third sector has reduced by 30% in this period. So a lot of squeezes coming into the services that provide for children and young people. During the pandemic, there was extra funding around summer programmes, around the Youth Work Education Recovery Fund, which was really helpful, around outdoor education recovery, social isolations funding. Some of these things are still there, but a number of those interventions, which were really key, especially, I would say, some of the summer programmes in particular, offering activities and programmes in holiday periods, also linking to food insecurity. A number of these things, I think it's really important that we look at those again. And some of this connects to, I think, the need to strengthen the statutory basis of youth work, which is happening in other countries, and is also being discussed in this country.
Thank you. One of the themes that has come out over the last couple of weeks, but it has also been prevalent in other parts of the evidence that the inquiry has heard, is the intersectionality of impacts. Dr. Crawford, the potential for intersectionality is probably quite apparent in the name of your organisation. But could you perhaps tell us about the intersectional effects that were noted?
So I think there's any of our young people, and I don't mean this as a just, but any of our young people are not just young people. They have additional barriers to living their life. And that's not as a result of COVID, it's something that's always been there. So, for example, a heterosexual young person does not have to come out, whereas an LGBT or T young person has to come out. And that's not going to change. However, pre-pandemic, young people would have made a decision, say, about can I walk down the streets hand in hand with my partner? Can I dress or present myself in the way that is true and authentic to myself? And I suppose transitioning through COVID, some young people actually found that ability, as I touched on earlier, or found the space beneficial for them to actually say, no, this is who I am, and they can now reflect who they truly are in a very authentic way. But I suppose in parallel with that, the world has changed, and unfortunately at times is less kind, particularly to this community. So young people now coming out from the lockdowns actually had to reevaluate what the world was like. So what was once known is no longer. So the discussion about is it safe, is it okay to present themselves as they truly are, is heightened because they're having to reintroduce themselves and reconsider that. Just as an example, for Edinburgh Pride tomorrow, I know that young people, and this has happened sort of during the pandemic, they will leave their hometown, they will get on the train, at which point out comes the glitter, out comes the rainbow. They're there, they can have a wonderful, inclusive day, but as soon as they hit the train to go home, they don't feel safe and they will take all of that off to go back to their home environment. Now, that happened all the way through COVID, so young people would maybe have that access for a couple of hours, but then they'd have to take that all off and then just go back to, I suppose, living in a way that's not authentic to themselves. Now, that has knock-on impacts in terms of your mental health, in terms of your self-expression, in terms of how you're going to be comfortable learning. Because if you want to be there, to be ready to be learned, to be ready to engage, it's going to be much easier for you if you're actually comfortable in being your full self. And that's only thinking about, I suppose, the intersection of being young and being LGBTQ+. A lot of our young people are neurodivergent. They may have faith, they may have different abilities. And actually, when you're looking at that, of what that's doing is building on additional barriers that essentially were all exacerbated through COVID. I could keep going on, but I'll...
You mentioned the world, and I paraphrase, I apologise, but the world being less kind, if I can put it that way. And I think we can look at the news and probably see some reasons potentially for that. We, of course, are looking at the pandemic. Is there any particular reason that you feel relating to the events of the pandemic or the decisions or the response which His Lordship might want to take into account in terms of how that unkindness arose?
I think there's a couple of elements there. The first one is everyone moved online, and being online gives a degree of anonymity. That means that you can go on a social media platform and you can dislike someone for posting. You can troll them. You can post negative media much more easily. Now, you saw it very significantly for the LGB and particularly trans community in terms of an increase in hate speech, an increase in negative media. If you look from 2018, I think Trans Media Watch said there were something like 500 articles in the media that year about trans people. It increased 10 times during the pandemic. So suddenly trans lives were a public debate. So I think that media context and the anonymity is a significant one, and you'd see it within the LGBTQ plus sphere, but you also see it in terms of misogyny and the wider landscape that I suppose Tim touched on briefly earlier. The other aspect about that is young people being confined due to the lockdown broke down some of the social norms and societal barriers, and I'm sure you've heard about the change in behaviour. I mean, we've got the Antisocial Behaviour Summit that just recently happened, but some of that, the change in the environment, the lockdown, the restrictions, and then coming back out of that, there had been a change in terms of how society accepted behaviour and what young people felt they were able to do, and that manifested, I suppose, in reduced school attendance, but also actually more threatening behaviour in streets, an increase in young people feeling less safe in terms of at risk of homophobia, transphobia and hate crime. So sort of some of the context that COVID helped escalate through that online environment sort of translated back out following COVID as well.
You've mentioned there, I suppose, the effects of being in the digital world. Do you feel that there's anything that could have mitigated against that in terms of youth work or access or anything like that?
Yes, because youth work is human rights based, it's equalities based. All youth workers are doing this. They meet the young person where they are and they support them and they help them on that journey. And the lack of access to that for all young people meant that some of the challenges that they give themselves, that development is missing. Formal education is there to learn and to get that education. Youth work is so powerful because it meets the young person where they are and helps them go on a journey that suits them. And missing that means that some of the, I suppose, what we would maybe have considered acceptable behaviours didn't get passed on. Young people were then given a void and they just decided, oh, I see that on social media, that's okay to do. And there were no checks and balances because there was no one there for that. So I think youth work really missed a gap. And while I think Scotland actually worked very well in terms of maintaining a line around inclusion, that was not represented across the UK, and quite prominent voices in England actually also made this acceptable because you could see visible people challenging the community, and that, I suppose, also socially made it slightly more acceptable. And again, not having the access to youth work meant there was no way to have that discussion, that constructive challenge in a safe environment for the wider young people right across Scotland to I suppose, self-regulate.
Mr. Frew, if I could go back to the question of intersectionality for a moment. You mentioned in your statement a number of other intersectional impacts. Could you perhaps highlight some of those for His Lordship?
Yes, absolutely. I think when we talk about intersectionality, the first thing is to remember that young people themselves, as of being young people, themselves can be discriminated against, and you know, so when you add to that, you know, maybe disabilities or people from BME communities, there can be some other aspects which kind of compound that. You know, it was mentioned from Vary about youth work is human rights work, as the former Commissioner for Children and Young People emphasised. So children's rights wellbeing impact assessments, did they take place the way they would have done with the UNCRC coming in? I know that in terms of, and Jamie might want to say more, in terms of the educational offer for children and young people maybe didn't feel they had the say around how exams were being framed for them and how things were changing. On top of that, if you look at maybe disabilities, to take one, I spoke to Deaf Action, and things like lip reading and so on. Social distancing had an impact on young people to be able to, you know, if you're more than 2 metres away and you have a face covering on, that created an issue. So there were some workarounds and you know, thinking around these things. On the flip side, you know, for young people, actually some of the Zoom and the technology, this has already been mentioned, actually provided an opportunity to access and to be heard more strongly than they would have been in terms of, you know, so the digital platform and Zoom and Teams allowed young people to present in the way that they wanted to, and sometimes that actually was helpful. In terms of BME communities, we certainly found that we got a lot of feedback from organisations like Intercultural Youth Scotland and around young people feeling disproportionately affected by this, often because with New Scot, it's a different issue in terms of New Scots, but there was a number of intermediary bodies that maybe weren't connecting in the way with smaller community-based groups, and so maybe the funding or the information wasn't getting to where across the piece to get there. We've certainly done a lot of work at YouthLink around the United Voices Collective and making sure that BME communities are getting the same access to support and advice and guidance. You know, you could also combine that with what was going on across the world and across America. There was some young people, I think this was an Intercultural Youth Scotland survey, that talked about seeing more police officers on the streets and so on, in terms of, you know, making sure that people were, following the guidance that for some young people from black and people of colour found that, you know, a little bit more intimidating than other communities would. So that's just some examples. There's, you know, we could talk about the care system, young people with, you know, young carers. There was a lot of intersectionality. I think it's really important, and I think we would all say this, that we're very conscious that we are, you know, one step removed from that. We're not the agencies. We're, in your case, you know, you are very much working with a group of young people under a protected characteristic, but I would want to be seen that we're speaking on their behalf. But the reports that have been written and the research that's been done and already submitted to the inquiry, I think it's really important to go back and hear those voices and some of the quotes that we're not able to give directly today, but that is in that evidence and material, is really worth seeing, to see that intersectionality and the sort of double impact on some communities.
Thank you. And I can confirm, my Lord, we have copies of those reports, and those, of course, are being looked at. Mr. Dunlop, Mr. Frew touched upon it there briefly, but you've already spoken about the interaction and the engagement that you would ordinarily have with government through the Scottish Youth Parliament. Do you feel that young people were properly consulted during the pandemic?
I think there was slightly more spaces for young people to be involved in decision making or be consulted. So, for example, the Scottish Qualifications Authority, SQA, hosted a national qualifications group that met weekly and fed into the Education Recovery group chaired by the Cabinet Secretary. A young person sat on that group for the duration and still does to this day. To represent the views and voices of young people. But they often, within that group, both during COVID but also now, are the only volunteer that isn't being paid to be there. They are sometimes asked to represent the voices of every young person in the Scottish education system and be that link which that is impossible to be without thorough consultation and meaningful participation. So I think COVID offered opened different spaces for young people to be involved and have a seat at the table, whether that was a meaningful engagement or a meaningful opportunity for that young person to participate, to represent. I'm still not sure about. During the pandemic, the Scottish Youth Parliament and the Children's Parliament still met with the Cabinet, we still met with the executive team in government. We were able to raise issues of importance for young people. We still consulted with thousands of young people about those. So there was still a kind of mechanism and a process, but I think it was narrowed slightly to look at COVID recovery and responses to the pandemic rather than kind of the wider societal issues that young people may have ordinarily brought up and still bring up because of a result of the pandemic. I think also in relation to exams and exam results and the qualification and assessment of young people during the pandemic, it was decisions were being made without adequate consultation for young people. Teachers were being consulted, unions were being consulted, other education bodies were being consulted, and young people until a youth parliament campaign, which was supported by other organisations, to kind of drive forward that or bring to light the inequities and how unequal some of the decisions were being made. Came to light young people's voices weren't taken as seriously as teachers and other education professionals. We also appreciate that it was unprecedented times, so people were trying to make the decisions and trying to pivot an education system that is reliant on desk-based exams or rather than taking an experience, assessing continuous assessment. So they had to move very quickly. But for example, with the during the first lockdown, with exam results, results were aggregated based on teacher assessment, and it transpired that the aggregation benefited those in a higher SMID index to those in a lower. So there was still a poverty inequity to the exam results, which got changed based on campaigning work by youth workers and by the third sector, along with others, to more positively reflect the attainment and what young people can achieve. But it was a huge challenge to get decision makers in some of these organisations to listen to young people's views, because, again, quite rightly, in some cases, they were more concerned about young people during COVID being exam results or attainment being at a lesser level to those that came before them or after. So I think young people were brought to the table, but it was in a way that could have been more structured and more engaging, so that it was a meaningful experience for all young people. And just to touch on one of Tim's points, if I may, around intersectionality, part of the lockdown lowdown responses from some young people from an ethnic minority background, they reported that they felt a disparity between the consideration of restrictions being lifted at Christmas versus the second lockdown was reintroduced around the time of Eid, and how that was taken into consideration. So that's just something I'd like to add on to that, if that's okay.
Thank you. Before letting you off the hook on the question of consultation, Mr. Nolan, I have perhaps some specific questions just to ask you about, and in particular whether the Scottish Youth Parliament received any information or was consulted specifically in relation to some of the perhaps more important or more central matters for young people. I mean, in particular, were the Scottish Youth Parliament consulted about lockdown, either its imposition or its withdrawal?
No, not before it was introduced.
And were they given any information directly about plans for that?
No,
to your knowledge?
not to my knowledge.
The other question, I suppose, and maybe I'm thinking perhaps back to my own youth, but I suspect it probably affected young people more than others, was the question of vaccine passports and access to venues and the like. Again, was that something that was discussed with the Scottish Youth Parliament?
No, not discussed with us. I think, no, we got the information the same as everybody else. I think one thing to say is now with the incorporation of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child into Scots law, I would hope that any future pandemic would have a child rights impact assessment, wellbeing and impact assessment, which would look at the rights implications of any future pandemic response.
Thank you. Dr. Crawford, you mentioned in your statement engagement with public authorities during the pandemic. How did you find dealing with public authorities during the pandemic?
Generally, for example, if I look at Scottish Government, they were trying very hard to be available and engaged and supportive. They were, generally very helpful in trying to support organisations to pivot, and we certainly had access. There was an awful lot that needed to be worked through at pace, and some real challenges in relation to that. And if I just refer back to Jamie's point about vaccines and vaccine passports, we talked about some of the challenges, particularly for trans young people, in terms of accessing that and feeling safe to access vaccines due to disparities in documentation. LGBTU Scotland was not directly involved in that, but we were working with Scottish Trans, who led on that for the trans community in Scotland, and they certainly had good access within Public Health Scotland, I know, to engage and to discuss on that, because there were some real risks and challenges for the community where their documentation doesn't match.
Just to be clear, when you say that documentation doesn't match, what do you mean by that? Their identity documents might not match their CHI number and NHS records. Their NHS records may be at a different address or also in their dead name, whereas actually being able to update much of their other documentation, so proving who they are would be a challenge. And what effect does that have in terms of potential access to services? There's
greater fear. Will they be accepted? Will they be recognised that they are who they are? It comes back to what I was talking about earlier in terms of the confidence, in terms of, for example, a lesbian or a gay young person walking down the street hand in hand. It's, will you be accepted? Will this be okay? And it's like that, but I suppose amplified for the trans community. Will they be recognised? Will they will the documentation match? Will they be pulled aside? Will they be singled out for this? And that can, I suppose, have a detrimental effect on mental health and certainly put a lot of fear into the process. And then if they are not able to access, then there's I suppose, discrimination in terms of them being able to access the right to health.
Thank you. I just have one final question, which I'm going to put to Mr. Frew. I'll give him notice in a moment. After that, I'm going to give you each an opportunity, if there's anything that you particularly want to raise to His Lordship, either something we've talked about this afternoon or not. We only have a few minutes left, but if there is anything you particularly want to raise or highlight to His Lordship, I'm going to give you that opportunity. Before I do that, though, Mr. Frew, if I could perhaps just ask you one final question. You mentioned in your statement the government's approach to the response, which was based, as we've heard in evidence before, on the 4 harms. And you indicated, again, consistent with evidence we've heard, perhaps about the prominence of the health response. In the context of youth work and young people and the matters that we've discussed today, do you feel that the balance that was struck in the 4 harms was right?
I think that consideration of the wider harms, not just harm 1, as the information came in and developed, clearly harm 1 was absolutely the priority. Everybody understands that, but as we started to understand that some young people maybe didn't need to shield later on, or the information came in about the impact of the pandemic specifically on children and young people, and I think that there could have been more consideration of the wider harms at that point. That was certainly raised, and other people raised it in the kind of COVID recovery group that I was part of with government, that we never seemed to have enough time in the agenda once we went through the reporting, the clinical data around what was happening, that there wasn't enough emphasis on those wider, longer-term harms. So it did feel at some point, so the focus on clinical health overtook the public health approach and the thoughts around wider impact on children and young people in terms of their education, their loneliness, potential in and around abuse, I suppose, as well within homes, and how we were kind of managing that, given that young people were more likely to be in the home environment, which is not safe for every child and young person. So I'm not saying that it wasn't. It was clearly part of a 4 harms framework, but I think there could have been more emphasis on the wider harms as throughout, but especially as we knew more about the clinical impact on children and young people being much less than it was initially feared.
Do you feel that there has been any detriment to young people because of that difference in balance?
I do. I think it's going to take some time, to research. There's a lot of research going on in and around this, and there'll be clearly. We mentioned social media and the social. We're working with Public Health Scotland as a sector to sort of support research around the digital determinants of mental health and how that's affecting young people. So you can't rule out the wider changes that were going on in society as well and what impacts they may have. But in terms of social isolation and loneliness of children and young people, their lack of access to safe spaces to congregate, and all of the socialisation that happens for children and young people are those key transition points that I mentioned earlier. There was clear feedback from youth workers and teachers and others working with children and young people that those key moments around socialisation and around personal and social competence development for children and young people were missed for certain cohorts of young people. And I do think that does have a bearing on how young people feel as part of the community, and also young people missing out on some employment routes or possibilities as well. I do believe that there's been a sort of disproportionate impact on children and young people because of that.
Thank you. We have just got a few minutes left, but as I say, I'm going to come to each in turn. Mr. Dunlop, perhaps I could start with you.
I think as Tim just said, the impact on young people's mental health from the pandemic is something I think we're going to see over a number of generations, and it's something that I feel there hasn't been and this was when we were given the statements, this was evident as that. It's probably the first time me and my colleagues have talked about our work during COVID for quite a while. So I think there's some learnings to unpick there about how people can express how they experienced COVID, but also learnings across government and the third sector about reacting to needs and prevention, and the lessons we learned during COVID about how things can happen quickly through collaboration and removing some of the traditional barriers of funding and outcomes to make a better need or a better assessment for improving the lives of young people. I'm always an advocate for having young people at the table. I think COVID started that journey, and Scottish Youth Parliament, along with others, are continuing that pressure on decision makers to have young people involved, and we are continuing our work to do that in a meaningful and engaging way.
Thank you. Dr. Crawford?
I think for me, I appreciate that this inquiry is focused on the 2020 to 2022 period, and I think that's very important. But I think the impacts of that are going to be felt, are being felt long term. And I think one of the learnings for me is that the provisions that were put in, so some of the COVID recoveries that Tim talked about, actually you just talked about now, Jamie, about long-term mental health, I think those provisions haven't been put in place. So as Tim touched on, sort of funding's diminishing, which then makes it much harder for all of the youth work organisations to deliver and to make sure these young people are supported. And I think there's a learning around that in terms of the longer term support needed for these young people, and we're seeing it in the antisocial behaviour. We're seeing it in sort of playing out in many spheres, and I think there's an opportunity in the learnings that come out from this inquiry to actually say, well, actually, we need that longer term engagement to help address the mental health challenges, to help address some of the behaviour challenges that we're still experiencing, to try and address that for the future.
Thank you. And Mr. Frew?
Thank you. Yeah, I think inequality in terms of educational outcomes for children and young people was pronounced and well known about before the pandemic, and it's been exacerbated through the pandemic. Healthy outcomes for children and young people, mental health and well-being was not great before the pandemic, and it's been exacerbated by the pandemic. So those are really important things. From my perspective, there's a number of wraparound services that we need to think about in terms of outdoors, sports, arts, and youth work as an educational practice is key to part of that. So I am looking ahead and saying, you know, the strengthening of the statutory basis, which has been talked about, and this isn't just about public service provision of youth work, just to be clear, it's about the entitlements for children and young people to access, whether it be through uniformed youth organisations, through employability youth work organisations, even youth work organisations that are delivering in hospitals. It's in so many different contexts. So I think strengthening the statutory basis of that will protect it, so that if we have this situation again, you know, we have those kind of wraparound extra services for children and young people. That's really vital. If I could just mention one other thing that hasn't been mentioned today, which was the outdoor education. There was a kind of campaign to save our outdoor education centres. So a number of our outdoor education centres were missing out on some of either the business funding or the third sector funding, because they had an income generation aspect of what they were doing. And you know, I think that was a good example of where, you know, government listened to the sector and put some funding into that, also supported education recovery through the outdoors. That was all vital, and I think, but it also worried me that it was quite close to being, some centres were quite close to being closed down, and it would have struggled to come back. So protecting the sort of wider educational offer for children and young people, and thinking about how that is quite broad and it's sometimes complex and not easy. I think we even see that in one of the members' bills at the Parliament at the minute, looking at strengthening the opportunity for children and young people to have a residential outdoor experience during their schooling. I think that's another sign of you know, politicians and others looking and saying, what are the things that we have as part of that wider educational offer, that right for young people to have a broad, we've mentioned Articles 28, 29, a broad education that goes beyond our sort of academic schooling. The need to kind of protect that and going forward, I think, is really important.
Thank you. Thank you all. My Lord, unless your Lordship has anything further, that's all my questions.
Thank you, Mr. Turner, and thank you all for your evidence today. Very grateful. Very good. 11:30.
All right.
Now, Mr. Gale.
Morning, my lord. The next witness is Professor Angela O'Hagan.
Good morning, Professor.
Good morning, Madam.
Now, Mr. Gale.
Professor O'Hagan will be speaking to a Rule 8 response that the Scottish Human Rights Commission has provided us with. The reference to that document is SCI SHRCXX and then 4028. Professor O'Hagan, can you just tell us some introductory material, please? Your full name, please.
My name is Angela Rose O'Hagan.
Yes. Your background, obviously you're here as chair of the Scottish Human Rights Commission. Your background, please, your academic background, you're a professor. Can you tell us a little about the chair that you hold or held?
I became chair of the Scottish Human Rights Commission on the 26th of August 2024, and prior to that I was Professor of Equality and Public Policy at Glasgow Caledonian University, where I delivered the Masters in Citizenship and Human Rights, and then in 2020-21 created the new Masters qualification in Human Rights, which continues to run. Over the years, I have held a number of management positions and board roles in the third and statutory sectors, and I have been, for some years, the independent chair of the Scottish Government's Equality and Human Rights Budget Advisory Group, and a member of several working and advisory groups, including, during COVID, the Social Renewal Advisory Board.
Thank you. We'll look a little bit more into the structure of the I'll just call it the Commission, so I think we know what we're talking about. You do tell us about this paragraph 7 of the Rule 8 response, and you also tell us quite a lot about the people with whom you work. Can I just remind you not to name those people? Their names have been redacted in the statement. So with perhaps the exceptions of those people that I will name in questions to you, can you be mindful not to refer to them? The document that we're using around which to structure your evidence is this Rule 8 response, and just for the general public, this is a document that this inquiry requested from the Commission some time ago. It was a request for certain information. The Commission provided that, and I'd just like to ask you a little bit about the way in which the information within that document was assembled. You do tell us about this in more detail in paragraphs, I think, 31 to 37 sorry, 31 to 36. I don't want to go into all the technicalities of the way in which evidence and information was obtained, but I think we can see at paragraph 32 of that statement that the staff of the Commission typically generated their own notes and documents to varying specs and formats, and these would then be saved onto a central saver. As I understand it, your organisation in providing the Rule 8 was to some extent dependent upon obtaining information from colleagues within the organisation. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. And paragraph 35, you say that the Rule 8, and I appreciate this predated your involvement, but you say that the Rule 8 was compiled by reference to material currently available to the officers engaged by the Commission using best endeavours to get that information. And you caveat all that by saying that what is presented in this document cannot be vouched as an exhaustive account of the Commission's work, but can put it to you that it is the best endeavour that the Commission could work with in order to provide this information.
That's correct,
Yeah.
yes.
So also, taking some of what is said in that section of the Rule 8, do I take it that the information would be both written or access to certain written information, but also anecdotal information passed on by individuals?
I think it's fair to say that the documentation that informs the Rule 8 statement and my evidence today is a combination of documents in the public domain, which includes
Yes.
a fairly expansive suite of briefings and other published information, as well as records of meeting dates and who was present at some of those meetings, but it's not an exhaustive list of all the meetings, partly because of the fast-paced nature of elements of policy development at the time, where civil servants would maybe, just call, ask for a quick telephone call that wouldn't be routinely minuted. Minutes would, we assume, exist of formal working groups that the SHRC might have been involved in, but partly, well, I can't account for why, but I think part of the reason is the archiving system of the documentation at the SHRC, so that when an individual leaves, their files are they go as well off the main server. So there's no deliberate attempt to occlude, but simply a matter of practice at the time, both technical and in terms of how meetings were conducted and minuted. And so we have records of what was published, we have records from continuing staff notebooks, and that's the basis on which we have prepared the Rule 8 statement.
Thank you. I think I should also say that you provided, along with the Rule 8 response, a considerable number of documents. They include briefing papers that the Commission prepared on various subjects during the period of reference of this inquiry.
Yes.
And all those documents, they are put in context in the Rule 8. We have obviously so far looked at those documents, and we will continue to look at those documents. So please be assured of that. One point I would like to pick up at this stage, and that's what's said regarding minutes, regarding meetings that the Commission had with government officials and other stakeholders. This is at paragraph 46 of the Rule 8 response. It says there that meetings with those officials and other stakeholders were not minuted. Am I right in understanding that that would also include meetings with, using the global term officials, would also include meetings with ministers?
The meetings, there were a number of meetings. Some of them included government ministers. In the main, meetings between the SHRC and government were a mixture of meetings with the chair, with the senior management team, and with the legal team. So there's a range of different types of meetings.
Yes. But on the, if I can put it, on the government side of the table, that may have included government ministers. I think we can see that from a number of the meetings you referred us to.
Yes.
I'd like to ask you a little about that, partly in furtherance of a request by one of the core participants. Firstly, and from your perspective, by that I mean the Commission's perspective, and with the benefit of hindsight, do you think it would have been prudent to have had minutes of these meetings taken, circulated and agreed?
I think, well, hindsight is a wonderful thing. I think with hindsight and different procedures in place as well, then minutes of those meetings, particularly with government ministers, would have been helpful and appropriate. We do know from the published briefings and correspondence, because there was correspondence follow-up to meetings, and so we know from the published briefings and the correspondence, some of which is included in the submissions along with our Rule statement, that the Commission was consistently making the same points around the human rights framework and highlighting the need for that analysis in proposals, some of which came to the Commission very late in terms of immediately before or just after publication at times of Scottish Government positions. But the Commission position remained consistent in highlighting the need for human rights analysis and action within government.
Just going back to minuting meetings, it might be thought slightly strange that where meetings were with government officials, and including, as we can see, a number of cabinet secretaries or ministers, as they may be called, that they were not minuted, given that I suppose that these were matters that involved, these were meetings that involved discussion of matters of considerable importance. Did you find it, and I appreciate you're looking back, do you find it strange that the government didn't insist on minutes of these meetings being taken?
I don't know if the government have a record of these meetings, and I would have expected there to be a more formal note of those meetings. But as I say, if those minutes existed and had been stored in files that related to staff or members of the Commission or the Chair who are no longer there, then those materials have been archived, and the archiving system doesn't hold on to materials for this length of time. But as I understand it, we're now in the process, or have been for some time, of shifting to a different electronic record and information management system.
Another point, and this is at paragraph 44 of the Rule 8. It's mentioned that the Commission says that it is highly unlikely that there were ever text messages or WhatsApp messages between the Commission and the Scottish Government, but in any event, there are none in the possession of the Commission at present now. WhatsApp messages and text messages seem to exercise a lot of people. Not necessarily us, but they do seem to exercise a lot of people. Your position is that, so far as the Commission is concerned, the Commission thinks it highly unlikely that these existed as between officials of the Commission and government officials.
I would think that would be the case. It would be a very unusual way for us to communicate with government officials now, and I assume that would be the case then. But as I say, it's assumption, as I wasn't at the Commission at the time.
Right. Perhaps rather perversely, can we go back to some preliminaries? Can you just explain what the Commission is?
Sure. The Scottish Human Rights Commission was established in, well, the Act introducing the Scottish Human Rights Commission was the excuse me, the Scottish Commission for Human Rights Act 2006, and the Commission has been operational since the 10th of December 2008. The Scottish Human Rights Commission is Scotland's national human rights institution and is an accredited A-status national human rights institution within the United Nations system, which means we can report directly to the UN on human rights issues in Scotland. We are an independent body accountable to the Scottish Parliament, and our general duty is to promote human rights and in particular to encourage best practice in relation to human rights. And we do this in a number of ways, including publishing advice and guidance, conducting research, providing education and training, scrutinising law and policy, and by using our legal powers, which include a power of inquiry and intervention and own name litigation solely in relation to cases relating to the UN Convention on Human Rights. The Commission comprises a chair and up to 4 members of the Commission appointed by the Scottish Parliament corporate body, and the Commission sets the strategic direction of the Scottish Human Rights Commission and oversees the delivery of its strategic and operational plans. The Commission is supported by 4 staff teams across the functions of executive team, legal and policy, communications and engagement, and corporate services.
So, put shortly, it's the Commission is a public body, independent of government,
Yes.
but accountable to the Scottish Parliament.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. Just tell us about the A status that is referred to in paragraphs 4 and 6 of the Rule 8. Can you tell us how that is acquired and on what basis it is acquired?
There's, as you would expect, a fairly complex, exhaustive process which measures the functions, resourcing and execution of the functions of the NHRI in question, which is a process that is overseen by the Subcommittee on Accreditation, which is an entity within the UN Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights. And the process is supported and validated through the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions. And part of the process of securing and maintaining accreditation includes the extent to which, or an examination of the extent to which any national human rights institution is compliant with what are called the Paris Principles in relation to how the NHRI engages and discharges its duties in a pluralist context, engaging a range of what are called social forces, the extent to which the NHRI has legal and other competence to execute a range of scrutiny and accountability actions, and how effectively it's resourced to execute those functions. And that accreditation process is a cyclical one, so you don't receive your accreditation and that's it. There's a continual process of review.
You continue to be marked?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I think we can see from the Rule 8 that under the Establishing Act, the Commission is publicly funded. And I think you give the funding figure for one of the years within this inquiry's remit. Now, you've told us in some detail in this Rule 8 about strategic planning and operational decision making. And you also refer to the personnel at paragraphs 16 to 20. That's something we can read, and I don't want to go into any further detail about it. I would, however, like to ask you a little bit about what you say at or what is said. I keep attributing it all to you, but it's what the Commission says at paragraph 21 of the Rule 8, because I think this is a precursor to a lot of what follows in this response. And what you say at paragraph 21 is the Commission's planned work for 2019 to 2020 meant that we were well positioned to identify and react to the onset of the pandemic. And it goes on to say, we were already undertaking monitoring and scrutiny work across a range of rights issues, including justice, policing, prisons, mental health, and clinical guidance. Now, just in relation to that, given that the emergence of the virus and the pandemic that came with it in effectively into Scotland in February, March 2020. Given that that was largely unforeseen, how was it just good fortune that you were in this position to, or good fortune that the Commission was in this position to be able to address these issues at the very outset of the pandemic?
The core issues of justice, policing, places of detention and the treatment of people deprived of their liberty, and questions around social care, healthcare and mental health are fairly constant topics and themes within the work of the Scottish Human Rights Commission. And so the strategic priorities at the time had identified those issues, and within the mandate of the Commission in relation to promotion of awareness, securing realisation of rights and executing our mandate in terms of advice, guidance, research and monitoring the extent to which rights within specific areas of rights and specific policy domains are being experienced by people in Scotland. That's the core function of the Commission. And so that focus on justice, policing and prisons and mental health was already in train. Clinical guidance, I'm not sure particularly what specific areas of work there were at that time on clinical guidance, but I'm assuming that was related to mental health. Right. But by the time the Scottish Government came to follow the UK Government's legislation, or rather by the time the Scottish Government came to legislate, as the UK Government had already issued its own proposals, the UK Government had passed those proposals and given direction to devolved administrations, even though the Scottish Government hadn't issued its own proposals and did not consult the Scottish Human Rights Commission in the formulation of those proposals, the staff team had already begun to work up what the likely human rights implications might be of any forthcoming legislation on the basis of what we knew, what staff knew had been the content of the UK legislation.
So from that, do I take it that the Commission had an adequate or competent basis on which to address the emerging issues that the pandemic was presenting us with?
Yes.
Presenting the government with?
Yes, I mean, as I understand it, the staff team were engaged in what you would expect of the National Human Rights Institution to be engaging in a range of human rights analysis, anticipating what might be forthcoming in the Scottish legislation, looking at what was coming out from the UK Government, but also I think on the basis that anyone would be hard pushed to think of a human right that wasn't engaged or going to be engaged in what was to come, in what was to be significant challenges and significant interferences with people's fundamental rights and freedoms.
We'll come to the first indications, which were probably envisaged by the Commission. But we'll come to the first indications of what would be involved in a few moments. But there is just one other point that I'd like to take up with you at this stage. Is what's said in paragraph 22 of the Rule 8 response. And there is an acknowledgement, I think, about the need to be reactive and engage with the fast-moving policy environment. I think that everybody appreciates that was probably the case, and I think it's also something that you reflect on in paragraph 85 of the statement. And while this is a section on your lessons to be learned and matters that you point to so far as the inquiry is concerned, in paragraph 85, you say in the middle of that paragraph, we appreciate the Scottish Government was working within a particularly tight timescale at the beginning of the pandemic. But you go on to say, however, we believe that more of a recognition of the value of the input of of a country's national human rights institution in such an unprecedented situation would have led to earlier information gathering with potentially better outcomes in human rights terms. So taking those 2 points together, and we'll look at some of the substance that informs that. Again, taking those 2 paragraphs together, as I understand it, the Commission is acknowledging the exigencies which existed at the outset of the pandemic from the point of view of what the government had to deal with. But as I understand from what is said in paragraph 85, which you follow on with, notwithstanding those exigencies, you seem, as I understand it, to be saying that there should have been a greater recognition of the value of the input of the Commission. Is that right?
That is correct, yes.
We'll come to the more of the details of that in a moment, just so that we've got that clear. You go on in the Rule to talk about the relationship between the Commission and the EHRC. Just briefly, can you indicate what the relationship between your Commission and the EHRC was?
Certainly. The EHRC is the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which has jurisdiction on human rights, holds a mandate for human rights in England and Wales. And the EHRC is the regulator of the GB, the Great Britain Equality Act 2010. The Scottish Human Rights Commission does not have a mandate in relation to the Equality Act. It's perhaps worth noting that it is the UK is unusual in having 3 national human rights institutions: the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, the Scottish Human Rights Commission, and the Equality and Human Rights Commission, partly a product of our asymmetric devolution arrangements, but also of how the equality legislation has developed over the years, and indeed how devolution has functioned, and that we have these separate commissions in Scotland and Northern Ireland.
I think also there's a significance in the 2, or the scope of the 2 institutions under Article 14 of the ECHR. As you put it, there's an open list of statuses, which, so far as the Commission is concerned, those frame discrimination in much wider terms. Is that right?
Yes, the provision of Article 14 of the European Convention is a provision for non-discrimination, which is an international human rights principle. And so while the work of the SHRC does, of course, look to a range of how equality characteristics engage and are engaged in the realisation of rights. We don't use the language of the Equality Act, which talks about 9 protected characteristics. That's particular to the GB Equality Act. We talk in terms of non-discrimination, which can, as I say, apply to particular equality groups, but also areas of wider rights, so in relation to the enjoyment of economic, social and cultural rights, the enjoyment of civil and political rights, and, for example, and how individuals, for example, people living in poverty, might be grouped together there. But within that, we would then look to see what are the differences of experiences of people living in poverty in relation to women, older people, disabled people, people of colour, etc.
I think probably answers what I was going to ask you, which was what significance might there have been during the pandemic of that, I suppose, wider list of statuses that the Commission is engaged with?
I think in the first instance it serves as a reminder that human rights are universal and that should be applied to all, and that as human beings we are all born equal in rights equal in rights and dignity. And yet individuals, as parts of groups in society, have a different experience of the enjoyment of rights. And so from the outset, the Scottish Human Rights Commission was very clear that while everybody was experiencing, whether that was lockdown or illness or whatever, some groups would be having very different experiences on the basis of the structural discrimination that people experience on the basis of sex and gender, of race, of disability, age, etc.
Thank you. Can I move on to talk about the relationship between the Commission and the Scottish Government, both generally and obviously in the context of the pandemic? You've told us already that the Commission is independent of the Scottish Government. We understand that. You've provided us with some details of meetings that the Commission and officials within the Commission had with both ministers and officials in the Scottish Government in the early days of the pandemic. And you've also told us about some of the presentations which the Commission gave to the Scottish Parliament as the pandemic was progressing. Again, this is something we can all read, but I'd just like to reflect with you on the first contact which the Commission had with the Scottish Government, which was, I think, on the 19th of March 2020. Now, I think we'll find this referred to at paragraph 41 and following of the Rule 8 response. Now, here we can name some of the participants. This involved I think was it a meeting or was it done over the telephone? I'm not entirely sure, but however it was done, there was a meeting between the Commission's former chair, Judith Robertson, and some of the Commission's other officers, and they met with Mike Russell, who was then the Cabinet Secretary for the Constitution, Europe and External Affairs. And we can see it was a conference call. And what we're told in this Rule 8 was that the meeting was brief and that it had a particular purpose. And perhaps you could just explain what you understand that purpose to have been.
As I understand it, that was the first approach from the Scottish Government in relation to the emergency legislation that was about to come in, and so was the first engagement that the Scottish Government had sought from the Scottish Human Rights Commission in relation to that important matter. As it says in the Rule 8, the purpose of the call was largely for the Cabinet Secretary to inform the Commission of emerging plans, and that it was the first time the Commission was hearing of the forthcoming legislation. So there was no detailed discussion at that point, as I understand it. What the Commission Chair made clear at the time was there would be a number of human rights arising from the emergency legislation, and noting that the time period any new powers were to remain in force and the mechanisms for reviewing any lockdown powers required particular attention. So it was effectively an early briefing on what was going to happen, not a request for advice to inform what was going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Do you know what specific concerns the Commission had at that time? I suppose that might be a fairly wide question, because I assume it being presented with an indication of emergency legislation coming forward. Do you know if there was a particular indication given of what was likely to be contained within that emergency legislation?
As the legislation in Scotland was following on from
Yes.
the legislation that had been introduced by the UK government and the direction contained within that to the devolved administrations, and that this was on the cusp of the Scottish legislation being introduced to the Scottish Parliament, then that would have been the focus of that. It was to bring to the attention of the Scottish Human Rights Commission the emerging plans around that legislation, and the human rights concerns emerging around that were very significant in terms of those fundamental interferences in those extensive interferences in fundamental rights and freedoms across a range of issues, and the core advice and framing from the Scottish Human Rights Commission throughout was that whatever intervention there might be and whatever measures might be proposed by government, they always had to be justifiable, legal, proportionate and time-bound, and that was the basis of the Commission's advice or engagement in that first meeting, which was subsequently followed up in correspondence and written briefings, as I understand it.
Right. Do I take it from that by referring to the various factors that government should have regard to? Proportionality, time constrained, etc. Those would have been likely matters that were made clear to the government at that time.
Indeed, they were a consistent point and core repeated from the Scottish Human Rights Commission in all the published briefings and statements and others in relation to a whole range of contexts throughout the pandemic, and certainly in the first instance in relation to the emergency legislation.
Thanks. Now we'll come in due course to an observation which the former chair, Judith Robertson, made about the attention paid to human rights, and we'll come to that, but can we move on just briefly? You provided us with some details of the various stakeholders that you engaged with, and there's just a couple of points I'd like to take from that. It's apparent from, I think it's paragraph 49 of the Rule 8, that the Commission was contacted during the pandemic, really from an early stage, by a number of, if I can put it, non-government party politicians. So I think we can see references to Mr. Leonard, Mr. Cole Hamilton, and Mr. Ross, who were respectively the then leaders of the Labour Party, the Liberal Party, and the Scottish Conservatives. Now, I don't want to go into issues that might be seen to be political point scoring or anything of that nature, but can I just ask you, is that something that you would have expected, that other party politicians can access the Commission and draw to the Commission certain matters that are being referred to either by other members within their party or potentially their own constituents? Indeed,
it's a regular part of our work. In the general course of our work, we regularly receive or are approached by a range of individuals and from a number of sources, members of the public, civil society organisations and other public bodies, and of course parliamentarians. And during the pandemic, these sources all provided the Commission with valuable intelligence in identifying human rights issues as they were arising during the pandemic. And so it would not be unusual then or now for individual MSPs to directly approach the Commission with an area of concern as to what they might expect us to do about that varies. I mean, it could be a request for specific information. It could be, as was the case with Mr Leonard, to raise concerns around care homes, and then subsequently he approached the Commission again with questions about the experience of students, particularly in relation to further and higher education students. And Mr Cole-Hamilton, his request came in, his inquiry, or request rather, came in later and was specifically for an inquiry in relation to COVID certification, but his request as framed for us to conduct an inquiry was out with the scope of what the Commission could do, but that's not to say that there weren't concerns about the human rights dimensions of COVID certification. And when Mr Leonard approached the Commission with concerns about what was developing within a situation developing in care homes, the Commission was already engaged in providing advice on care homes and had expressed the need to ensure that human rights considerations were being addressed at the operational level of individual homes, particularly the restrictions on visiting. And so when Mr Leonard contacted the Commission, as I understand it, they were able to reassure him that within a matter of a couple of days, as I understand it, that briefing would be coming out, that analysis would be coming out, and the Commission issued a statement, I think, in that regard. So following the intervention from Mr Leonard, so I don't think there was any to use your phrase, party political point scoring. It's simply members of Parliament exercising their own accountability to their constituents and areas of concern.
Thank you. The other point I'd just like to ask you about is the significance of the letter that's referred to in paragraph 51 of the Rule 8, dated the 17th of April 2020. And this was a letter from the Commission to the Equalities and Human Rights Committee. I think there's a repetition there, but the Children and Young Persons Commissioner in Scotland, who you've already also referred to urge the committee to consider undertaking an inquiry into the equality and human rights implications of COVID-19. Yes. There are then observations made in relation to the issues that might be considered in that, the Commission called for an inquiry that was established on the 27th of April and was welcomed by the Commission. Can you just indicate from the Commission's point of view what further involvement the Commission had in relation to that inquiry?
Certainly. The letter, as you say, on the 17th of April, along with the Equality and Human Rights Commission and the Children's Commissioner, to the Equality and Human Rights Committee. It all gets a bit, some of the letters are the same. But that was to urge an inquiry as such on the basis that the Commission's argued that any measures taken should be necessary, proportionate and time limited in order to minimise their impacts on human rights and equality concerns, and to give the public greater confidence and in relation to consent and compliance if those measures are formulated on a basis that reflects an understanding of people's experience. At that time, we were 1 month into lockdown, and the Scottish Human Rights Commission and others were already highlighting the differential impact on groups of people, as I've mentioned. And the letter was to ask or to urge the committee to undertake an urgent inquiry into identifying groups and individuals disproportionately impacted by coronavirus and related measures, identify actions needed by the Scottish Government and all public bodies, including regulatory and oversight bodies, to minimise negative effects of any measures on equality and human rights, and to examine measures and their impacts on equality and human rights. Now, this was the first of many calls by the Scottish Human Rights Commission for a public inquiry into the human rights impacts. And at that time, it seems to me that the Scottish Human Rights Commission was very clear that a committee inquiry in real time would make a significant contribution to surfacing those issues and those experiences. As I understand it, there was no formal inquiry, but the committee did hold a number of specific evidence sessions to inquire into those issues. Evidence sessions at the Equality Human Rights Committee and then the COVID-19 Committee of the Parliament. And the Scottish Human Rights Commission attended 4, or was invited to attend 4 committee sessions during that period.
Thank you. Can I turn, and with one issue particularly in mind, to what you've said about public health and coronavirus legislation and regulations. You deal with this at paragraph 53 and following of the Rule 8. Very briefly, you've already made the point of the challenging circumstances in which legislation was having to be produced, and the speed at which it was being done. And I think you've indicated that there was perhaps a lessening of the analysis and scrutiny of legislation from a human rights perspective. We've heard a great deal in this inquiry about the translation of particularly regulations, but based on primary legislation, the translation of regulations into guidance, which was then applicable either to the population in general or specific areas of the populace in particular. Do you have any comment to make from a human rights perspective of what you know about, or what the Commission knew about, the use of guidance?
In relation to the emergency legislation, or in general?
In both, if I can.
Okay, so if I start with the emergency legislation, that the Scottish Human Rights Commission had not had any sight of the Scottish specific legislation prior to it being introduced to the Scottish Parliament. Had we been told of concrete plans or seen the legislation in advance, the Commission may have been able to provide much more tailored analysis and advice on the legislation, and thereby the impact on how any guidance was to be framed. Consistently throughout the pandemic, or the period in focus of the inquiry, the points repeatedly made by the Scottish Human Rights Commission were that guidance needs to include direction on human rights obligations, and not to either assume a level of knowledge or assume an implicit understanding. We know that the knowledge base on human rights and the within government, I think it's fair to say, and in a whole range of delivery, service delivery areas, is perhaps not as strong as it might be. And so guidance needs to be explicit on the human rights requirements and obligations. And so we were concerned, the Commission was concerned at the time, that wasn't the case in guidance around the emergency legislation, or subsequently in other areas. And the other thing that the Commission was consistently calling for or advising on was not just, as I've said, that measures need to be lawful, necessary and proportionate. So what's the proportionality assessment? Legislation, the Scottish Human Rights Commission were clear that taking emergency measures was permissible within the human rights framework, but they should strictly go no further than is necessary. And so that proportionality and consideration of what is the legitimate aim had to be at the forefront of legislation and in the measures introduced, and that in order for that to be, the guidance to be effective, that those limitations, those parameters needed to be well understood by people involved in delivering services, who themselves were under enormous pressure. And yes. I think we have to acknowledge that people were under enormous pressure, and so that strain was additional. So guidance needed to be clearly set out and step through what the human rights implications were and what in practice service deliverers should be doing. So in the case of, for example, care homes or visiting care homes, it wasn't sufficient to say there are human rights obligations. Needed to step that through for care home managers or whoever. And so in specific regard to care homes and visiting regulations, the Commission did say that the Scottish Government should be providing scenarios and other tools, other ways to help people delivering services be able to work through what a proportionality assessment is, what individualised care meant.
Yes. Well, that's really interesting. Thank you very much for that. I'd like to look at a number of specific areas of interest to the Commissioner. I'm conscious that time is slightly against us, so I'll confine these. Can I begin with DNA CPR notices, which is referenced in these related paragraphs 60 and 61. You do refer, or the Commission refers, to the revision of the CMO's clinical guidance on that, which was revised after consideration by the Commission, by the EHRC and Inclusion Scotland. And it was published on the 13th of July 2020. Now, again, I'm looking at a particular area of DNA CPR, and that is the possible blanket application to persons being brought either into hospital or into care homes, and also the need, as I understand it, certainly applying human rights principles, to have the issuing of a DNA CPR discussed with either the patient or resident concerned, or if that were not possible, with their family, if again that was possible. Now, after the issuing of the CMO's guidance on the 13th of July 2020, did the Commission seek any information about about whether or not that revised guidance was being observed? Do you know?
What I do know is the Commission's intervention did result in a change to the guidance. So the clinical guidance was published by the Chief Medical Officer on the 3rd of April 2020, and at that point a number of stakeholders representing older people and disabled people particularly contacted the Commission regarding reports of blanket non-treatment policies being applied to care home residents and do not attempt cardiopulmonary resuscitation notices being encouraged for those with long-term conditions without full discussion between doctors, their patients and carers, or appropriate processes being in place. At that point, the SHRC engaged with the Chief Medical Officer expressing our concerns and recommending revisions to the guidance. And the advice from the Commission was that the guidance should explicitly state what was and was not permissible in human rights terms, and this included clear guidance that blanket policies in areas such as anticipatory care planning and DNA CPR decisions are not permissible, and the need for support and decision making for individuals to ensure decisions about quality of life were not applied in a discriminatory way. So following that written advice, the SHRC, as you said, was invited to meet with the CMO and others, and along with other groups, the Commission revised the guidance, which was introduced in early 2020. As far as I'm aware from these statements and the evidence I've been given, I can't give a statement as to what proactive follow-up there was there, but by that time the Commission had also engaged in its own research on the experience of people resident in care homes at the time.
The reason I ask this is this inquiry has heard a considerable amount of evidence, and obviously it's for the inquiry to assess that, but has heard a considerable amount of evidence post July 2020 of the issuing of DNA CPR notices in circumstances that would tend to suggest that they were not issued after sufficient consultation with either the patient or with their family. So that's the reason I'm
Indeed.
interested in this. Can we look briefly, albeit it is an enormous subject, to care homes? The Commission provided a briefing on the 14th of July 2020, which I think highlighted a number of human rights issues which related to the experience of those in care homes and the engagement of various human rights in terms of the ECHR, Article 2, Article 3, Article 8 and Article 14. Now, so far as the Commission is concerned, we know that there was a change in guidance issued in October 2020, which I think you refer to. Following that change in guidance, did the Commission consider the recommendations which it had made in relation to care homes? And in particular, did the Commission ascertain whether, or was of the opinion, that care homes were provided with adequate support when care homes came to implement that guidance? It's a rather complex question, but I apologise for that.
There's a lot in there, and it's absolutely central to the focus of the inquiry and our own. It was clear to the Commission, clear to anyone, that support and treatment of people in care homes was an area of considerable concern. The right to life, Article 2 of the Convention, of course dominated the whole approach to COVID management, but has to be balanced by, or have concern to Article 8 to protect the right to life, the right to private and family life as well. Yes. So amongst the questions that the SHRC raised in its briefing, based on the analysis that the team had undertaken, was that there had to be attention to questions as to whether residents of care homes were afforded equal access to hospital treatment, whether clinical guidance was appropriate, and whether there was adequate personal protective equipment available to staff and residents, and whether the availability and distribution of COVID testing of care home residents and staff was adequate. And our analysis at that time also focused on the need for an effective investigation into deaths in care homes, highlighting the Article 2 requirements, which this public inquiry is one of the primary means of discharging. The briefing highlighted a number of concerns, as I say, where Article 8, including, so around private and family life, including the issue of restrictions on a person's movement, such as the inability of care home residents to receive visitors, and stressed the importance of any such interferences being proportionate and no more than necessary. So in September 2020, the Commission wrote to the Clinical and Professional Advisory Group for Care Homes and stressed that the human rights of residents and their families, as well as staff, should be foundational principles around which decisions on visiting are based, and that this should be explicitly reflected in guidance and decision making. As I say, highlighting the human rights framework, particularly around Article 8 and the correspondence of Article 5, which protects against arbitrary or unjustified deprivations of liberty. And again, at that point, the Commission warned against blanket decision-making and stressed the importance of supporting care home managers to make decisions compliant with human rights law on an individualised basis. The guidance that came out in 2020 could be characterised as falling short of including an explicit reference to human rights requirements in the guidance as we had recommended. Although there was no specific recommendation or reference to human rights law in the revised guidance as we had recommended, there was a shift towards what was called person-centred approach, which stressed the importance of taking into account individual circumstances and the needs of residents and their families. One of the significant developments there was around the definition of essential visit. And this iteration of the guidance made very clear that flexibility around the number, frequency and duration of visits when a friend or relative's loved one is deteriorating is at the reasonable discretion of the care home manager. Now that relates to my earlier point on guidance having to be clear and supportive of people having to operationalise, put that into operation in different contexts. So our concern was that not only that the guidance failed to explicitly reference the human rights of care home residents and their families, it didn't really support care home managers to really engage with the human rights requirements to make those individualised proportionality assessments, taking into account the individual circumstances of each resident. And so when you have guidance that doesn't explicitly reference human rights requirements, you have the danger then that a blanket approach is adopted as a default position. So in this instance, perhaps instead of saying that there were essential visits and care home managers could perhaps have given direction along the lines of you're obliged to take individual circumstances into account and to come to a human rights-based approach assessment. And that's where we had suggested that perhaps giving scenarios, giving some scene setting that would, and some assessment tools would really have helped care home managers in that context.
That's a point I'd like to just very briefly understand from you. You've raised it now twice, both in the generalised context of guidance and now more specifically in relation to care homes, and that is scene setting. Put crudely, is that giving those who are expected to implement this guidance examples of situations where this might apply?
Yes, exactly. So some scenarios, some case studies, and the tools, what questions you would ask, what processes would you step through to come to that, and that wasn't included.
Thank you. Briefly and slightly regretfully, can I finally look at prisons and places of detention? Now, in our discussions, and by that I mean you and I meeting prior to you giving evidence, I've mentioned to you the Let's Be Heard report in relation to the work that they have carried out regarding dialogue with prisoners. And I've also mentioned the evidence that this inquiry has heard in relation to the evidence of Alan Ingalls, who gave evidence regarding the death of his son, Callum, in Addiwell Prison. The concerns that have on issues that have been expressed, particularly in the Let's Be Heard, but also by Mr. Ingalls in the dreadful circumstances of his son's death. Are those matters that you as a commission would have envisaged at the outset of the pandemic?
Yes, I think it's very clear that the evidence of lived experience from prisoners in the Let's Be Heard project mirrors the issues that the Commission raised in its own briefings and guidance at the time. Along with members of what's called the National Preventative Mechanism, which comprises around 20 or so organisations, inspection bodies and so on, including the Scottish Human Rights Commission, there were a series of issues and a number of briefings and statements around the need to ensure the human rights of people deprived of their liberty were being upheld, and that included the need to reduce detained populations, to mitigate the inherent risk of maintaining people in close confinement, to reduce the numbers of people remanded to custody, and particularly important in terms of the detained population to consider underlying health conditions and those in other vulnerable categories, as well as the overcrowding of the detention estate. There was advice on maintaining principles of equivalence of care in relation to physical and mental health care to those in detention, so that those deprived of their liberty are not disadvantaged in accessing healthcare that they need, and measures to facilitate contact between detainees and ensure that detainees and their families, and other professional support, and the need to ensure the fundamental rights, including time out of cell, outdoor exercise and appropriate access to soap, water and showers, as well as telephones and healthcare. So many of these issues, as I say, were highlighted by the Commission at the outset, and this is part of ongoing work and interest that we have in places of detention. And we highlighted at the time consideration of impacts on mental health and potential increases in self-harm, suicidal feelings and use of illegal drugs, all of which has been confirmed by prisoners' own experiences. Now, some of the issues that the Commission raised at the time were addressed by measures taken by the Scottish Government and Scottish Prison Service. For example, the rollout of mobile phones and the use of virtual visits helped to restore access to prisoners' private and family life, but restrictive measures remained in place within the prison population for a lot longer than the general population. In relation to the case that you have raised, we have read the evidence of Mr Ingalls in relation to the death of his son, which is tragic and distressing. I don't want to say much more as there are live proceedings, but there are some comments, I think, or some observations on the human rights issues that emerge from Mr Ingalls' evidence. States should ensure that prisoners have access to the same standard of healthcare as is available in the community. But there's also a heightened duty of care towards people in the care of the state, as the prison essentially controls what access to healthcare they have. And at the time, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the World Health Organization advised that in suspected or confirmed cases of COVID-19, all persons deprived of their liberty should be able to access healthcare, including urgent specialised healthcare, without undue delay. And that, in addition, particular attention should be given to specific health needs of people with underlying health conditions or heightened vulnerability.
Professor O'Kagan, we're straying into extra time here. I understand that now becomes perhaps longer than it used to be. Can I just ask, in conclusion, what you say, or what the Commission says at paragraph 86 of its Rule 8. There is a quotation there from Judith Robertson, the previous chair, in evidence that she gave to the Equalities and Human Rights Committee on the 25th of February 2021. And this is an observation in relation to the way in which the Scottish Government had regard to human rights principles during the pandemic as at that time. So about a year into the pandemic. And the word that she used is, my honest answer to that, on balance, it has been patchy. Now, so far as you are aware, is that, well, could you indicate what you understand by that? And is it something which, from your experience and looking back, with which you agree?
I think I would agree with that. I think as we have covered in the Rule 8 statement and in comments today, the Scottish Human Rights Commission engaged with the Scottish Government, produced a significant volume of advice and analysis, some of which was clearly acted upon, and in other areas it is harder to find evidence that human rights were at the forefront of decision making. I think what we see across government perhaps is and not just in relation to the pandemic, but that human rights considerations are not front of mind, especially when there is other exigencies, as the term you used earlier on, other pressures on policymakers human rights can perhaps be regarded as optional or secondary considerations which aren't the forefront of the pressing business. And I think during the period in focus, there clearly could have been much better mainstreaming of human rights across the government. That's what they say they do. Which mainstreaming means taking into account at all stages across all policy areas, and I think we haven't seen that. While there were some positive examples of where our guidance and intervention and advice did make an impact, there were a number of other areas where we did not see that advice being taken.
Professor O'Hagan, thank you. Lord, I apologise that we've strayed over time, but I think it's been important to obtain the Professor's views on these matters. That's all I have to ask, unless Your Lordship has any matter.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Gale. My apologies as well. Possibly we should have timetabled a little bit longer for you. But what you've said, as Mr Gale has correctly said, will be considered in full in any event. I'm very grateful for your time today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
1:30 for the last witness in this particular
latitude, yes.
impact hearings.
Yes, yes.
1:30.